What is the fawning trauma response? So broadly speaking, there are 4 main trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and today we are going to talk about fawn. So Pete Walker coined the term fawning, and generally speaking, it's related to codependency. But for me, I really couldn't see myself in codependency, in the language of codependency, the codependency recovery literature or community. I think in part because that word has become so stigmatized, right? There's sort of judgment about it, like, come on, just put yourself first, as though it's a choice. And it's sort of seen in this kind of shameful way. At least I've experienced it that way. And so I'm like, well, that's not me. Like, I'm not a codependent, you know? So I couldn't see myself in that language. Additionally, the word codependency comes out of the chemical dependency recovery world. And so it feels kind of tethered to that, when in fact codependency can be experienced in all kinds of systems, addicted or not. So for me, learning about the fawning trauma response put this codependent behavior in the perspective of survival, right? It's not a conscious choice. It's not something you can just choose to do. It was the body's instinctual response to threat. And when I saw it that way, I thought, oh yes, that makes sense. That's what I've been doing. I've been abandoning myself in order to seek safety. And it really allowed me to finally start to make sense to myself. The other reason that I think that the language of codependency can be tricky is because it can also inadvertently pathologize any sort of a relational dependency. And the reality is we are hardwired for relationship, right? I have mirror neurons that are reflecting back what's going on in your world. I will instinctually sort of mirror back what you're doing. We do this with each other all the time. We don't even know that we're doing it. Our nervous systems can co-regulate. It's how we take care of our babies when they're little. They're using our nervous system to find calm and safety within their own skin. So we co-regulate, we cohabitate, we need one another, okay? So dependency, mutual dependency is not pathological. As a trauma response, fawning puts pretty much everyone else's, your needs and everyone else's needs above mine. And we do this out of fear, that I'm not gonna be okay because you're not okay. And I have felt like my own survival was dependent on making other people feel better, safe, that I've been kind of waiting for them to sort their stuff out. There's this hopefulness that's embedded in fawning that's like, eventually there's this belief, and it's really more of a fantasy oftentimes, that the other person is finally going to rise above, get their stuff together, be able to show up for us. And so there's this, it's gonna happen, right? Like if I keep showing up for, it's not happening. What's going on? There's a lack of reciprocity. And yet, when we're in that fawning trauma response, we don't see that as a sign that we should do something different. It's like we see it as a sign that we need to try harder. So when we see fawning and codependency in this way from a perspective of survival, we really get to make sense to ourselves. Of course, we're prioritizing safety and connection, right? It means everything. But when we pathologize ourselves or judge ourselves for it or judge other people for it, it really feels as though we're meant to sort of just get over it, and it's missing the fact that it's there to protect us. So I have a great reverence actually for all of the trauma responses, for the wisdom in our trauma responses that are there to keep us safe. I mean, the instincts of our instincts are beautiful to me. Fawning is really a mirroring of others' perceived desires or expectations in order to diffuse conflict, and like I said, to find safety. So it's a merging where your boundaries are completely surrendered. Like, what's a boundary? There is no boundary really when we're talking about fawning. There's a lack of assertiveness. There's the urge to appease. We over accommodate. There can be a complete submission even to someone who has harmed you. So you can see in that way that we are inadvertently putting ourselves in harm's way, even as we're attempting to keep ourselves safe. Fawning is a common response with complex trauma. So we often see it where there was at least one narcissistic parent in a family system, addicted family systems, dysfunctional, neglectful family systems. The fawning trauma response is a common outgrowth of growing up in one of those family systems. So if you grew up this way, you might find yourself unconsciously privileging other people's needs. And the tricky thing is when it becomes fixed, when it becomes sort of a stuck, chronically on trauma response, we don't just do this when we feel threat or danger. We do it all the time. We do it when we don't need to do it. We become so habituated to not stopping and feeling and owning our own sense of self because safety and connection was only found when I privileged you and your situation first. And so it's really hard. It can be really hard to come out of that. It's like this backpedaling into own self and feeling into, what do I feel? What do I think? What do I need? You might even ask yourself those questions in this moment. See what answers arise. So the fawning trauma response often goes hand in hand with repetition compulsion or trauma reenactment. So I've done some other videos on trauma reenactment. And the reason is because safety was found in being exploited, in being abused, in being neglected, in not being taken care of. We found a way, even if it's a small bit of safety, even if it's a tiny bit of connection, it's better than none at all. And now it's been equated with these harmful relationships and situations. So what happens is as we move about our life, even, growing up and moving out of the house, for me personally, my sense of safety in the world was found in relationships where I was exploited, in relationships with people who were unavailable. It was like I kind of intuitively knew, those are my tools. It was like I got turned on when I came into those types of dynamics. It was like, I know what to do. I know how to do this. I know how to prioritize you. Truth be told, in large part, I probably became a therapist reenacting a trauma response. Not in terms of being exploited, but in terms of only existing when I'm of service to others. And so what I have had to look at is, how am I perpetuating those old wounds? How can I find my self-worth, my sense of safety and self in other ways that aren't just about somebody else? I think the other tricky thing with fawning is that it tends to be coupled with a very low self-worth. And this is what we see with complex trauma generally. But if I don't really exist unless you see me, and yet what we're dealing with is someone who has an inability to really see me or show up for me, it just perpetuates that idea that I'm not worth it, I'm not lovable. If they can't see me, I must not be worth seeing. And so what do? We try harder. We try harder. Okay, I'm going to be even of greater service and figure out what your needs are and be the best, whatever it is. So that one day, again, that fantasy, you're going to come back and do the same for me. So when we look at it this way, we can see that a part of coming out of, consciously choosing to come out of a fawning response, is to stop this perpetual gaze towards other as the person that's going to fix it, solve it, make it better. I need closure, I need resolution, I need your love, I'm not worthy unless you choose me. And we have to turn our gaze back towards ourselves and choose ourselves, even if we've never been chosen before. I know for me, this idea of self-love was a tough pill to swallow. Honestly, because it just felt in my body disgusting. It felt like a placebo. It felt like it wasn't enough. And yet, what I have found is that over time, the more that I have set healthy boundaries, walked away from things that weren't working, chose myself no matter what, I'm getting real-time experience, felt experience in my body that it is enough. It's more than enough. In fact, it not only changes me and my relationship to me, the more that I choose me, it changes my chemistry. It changes who I'm attracted to, right? Because it changes this old dynamic that I'm only safe and seen in exploitation, in being with narcissistic partners, in being with someone who's unavailable. Suddenly, when I'm available to myself, I don't feel as attracted to that dynamic in other people, right? So it's really powerful when we do this work of leaning into self-love, self-compassion, self-care, and not just the ideas of these things, because who doesn't love the ideas, but behaviorally, even if you're acting as if, behaviorally choosing yourself, loving yourself. Sometimes it feels really hard and challenging, even painful to do those things. And yet, it's not for nothing, right? This reclaiming of ourselves and our self-worth is worth it. So the other tricky thing with fawning is I think it can look like service. It can look like kindness. It can look like altruism. But it is none of these things if it's at the cost of abandoning yourself. That is not kind. That is not true service. It's not compassionate if we're not being compassionate to ourselves at the same time. My name is Dr. Ingrid Clayton. I'm a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist, and a trauma survivor. This channel is dedicated to the intersection of narcissistic abuse, for me it was childhood abuse, and complex trauma, or CPTSD. Today we've been talking about fawning. I hope you'll subscribe, drop any comments if any of this resonated with you. How has fawning shown up for you? How have you found more flexibility with relation to that trauma response? I'd love to hear it. And thanks so much for being here.